Imagine for a moment that everything you believe about yourself, every certainty, every fear, every quiet assumption tucked away in the back of your mind is not truly yours. Imagine that your personality, the story you tell yourself about who you are, is nothing more than a mask, an exquisitely constructed illusion you inherited without ever questioning. Terence McKenna believed that the real journey of a human being begins the moment this illusion cracks. And right now, as you listen, you're standing at the edge of that crack, staring into a deeper version of yourself waiting on the other side. Most people will never take this step, not because they are incapable, but because they are terrified of meeting the parts of themselves they've spent a lifetime hiding. McKenna called this avoidance the silent hypnosis of ordinary life, a trance so complete that you don't even know you're under it. It's the trance of routine, of identity, of playing roles handed down by culture, family, and expectation. You learn to smile when you feel broken. You learn to say, "I'm fine," when your soul is screaming for change. You learn to repeat the script society writes for you, never daring to question who's holding the pen. But here's the truth McKenna wanted you to remember. Beneath that script, beneath that mask, beneath the noise of all the voices telling you who you should be, there is another voice, a more ancient voice, a more honest voice, a voice that doesn't speak in words, but in impulses, intuitions, dreams, fears, and flashes of insight that appear in the quiet moments when the world stops demanding your performance. This voice is the shadow, the part of you that refuses to be ignored forever. And shadow work, in McKenna's world, wasn't some polished psychological technique. It was a radical act of rebellion against everything false within you. Think of the shadow as the mirror you've been avoiding. It shows you the emotions you reject, the desires you suppress, the memories you hide, and the truths you bury. You think you're running from discomfort, but the truth is simpler. You're running from yourself. And McKenna believed that the only way to be free, the only way to truly awaken, is to stop running. So let's step closer to that mirror. Look at your life as it is right now. Strip away the excuses. Strip away the stories. Strip away the polished version of you that you show to the world. What remains? What emotions have you swallowed so many times that you no longer taste them? What dreams have you left to die because they didn't fit the version of you others expected? What fears have shaped your decisions so subtly that you never saw their fingerprints? There's a deep psychological truth hidden here. The parts of yourself you refuse to meet are the same parts that control you the most. Every suppressed emotion leaks through the cracks. Every unhealed wound dictates your choices. Every buried truth becomes a quiet puppeteer behind your actions. You think you are in control, but the shadow is steering the ship while you pretend to hold the wheel. McKenna believed that confronting this hidden realm requires a kind of internal courage most people never cultivate. Not the performative courage we show on the outside, but the raw, unfiltered courage of sitting alone with yourself and refusing to look away. You can lie to others. You can even lie to your conscious mind. But the unconscious always knows the truth. And it waits. You feel it in the moments you can't distract yourself. When the noise fades. When the world quiets. When your mind finally runs out of places to hide. That's when the shadow taps your shoulder and whispers, "I'm still here." Shadow work begins the moment you answer, not with confidence, not with certainty, not with some heroic declaration, but with a simple, trembling willingness to look at what you've denied. This is where McKenna's philosophy becomes brutally honest. He said that humanity is addicted to its illusions, not because they make us happy, but because they make us feel safe. We cling to familiar suffering rather than risk unfamiliar truth. We protect our limitations because they are predictable. We defend our pain because we know its shape. And yet somewhere inside you there is a deeper longing, a longing to break the pattern, to step outside the trance, to meet the version of yourself you have never allowed to exist. You feel it when you stare at the ceiling at 3 a.m. You feel it when you're tired of repeating the same emotional cycles. You feel it when there's a quiet ache inside you whispering, "This isn't who I'm meant to be." Shadow work is the doorway. McKenna described the human psyche as an inner landscape filled with uncharted territory. He believed that every fear you avoid is a territory unexplored. Every trauma you hide is a territory unvisited. Every truth you deny is a territory you refuse to map. And until you walk into those territories, they remain haunted, not with monsters, but with memories, not with demons, but with the versions of you that you abandoned along the way. You can feel those abandoned selves sometimes. They show up in sudden anger you don't understand, in sadness that seems to come from nowhere, in the anxiety that lives in your chest like an unwanted tenant, in the recurring patterns of relationships that leave you exhausted and confused. These are not coincidences, they are signals, echoes from the parts of you that are still waiting to be acknowledged. McKenna believed that every human carries an inner wilderness, and the wilderness becomes more dangerous the longer you avoid entering it. But the moment you turn inward and face what's waiting there, something extraordinary happens. The shadow stops chasing you and starts guiding you. The fear stops overwhelming you and starts teaching you. The illusion stops comforting you and starts dissolving. This is where the real transformation begins. You start noticing the lies you tell yourself. You start recognizing the masks you wear without thinking. You start seeing the patterns you repeat because they feel familiar even when they hurt you. You start understanding why certain memories still ache, why certain people trigger you, why certain fears linger long after the danger has passed. McKenna believed that this awareness is the first crack in the trance, because once you see the illusion, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to pretending. You can't return to the story you once believed. Awakening is irreversible, and yet awareness is only the beginning. The real challenge begins when you start asking the question the shadow is waiting for. What part of me have I abandoned, and why? Maybe you abandoned your creativity because someone told you it wasn't practical. Maybe you abandoned your authenticity because the real you wasn't accepted. Maybe you abandoned your confidence because you were taught to doubt your own worth. Maybe you abandoned your truth because staying silent felt safer than being seen. These abandoned parts become the shadow, and the shadow waits patiently for your return. McKenna believed that the journey inward is the greatest. A familiar reaction suddenly feels alien, as if you're watching yourself from a distance. Words you used to repeat without thinking feel hollow. Beliefs you inherited without questioning begin to dissolve. But this isn't regression. It is excavation. You are digging through layers of identity, brushing away the dust of old narratives, revealing pieces of yourself that were buried long before you had the strength to face them. As these buried pieces come forward, you begin to notice parallels in your behavior, patterns that repeat across relationships, career choices, reactions, and desires. The shadow reveals itself through these patterns, not as an enemy, but as a map. Every painful pattern is a message. Every triggered emotion is a signal. Every uncomfortable truth is a doorway. McKenna believed that the psyche never hides anything without also leaving a trail. When you follow that trail, you begin to uncover the deeper motivations shaping your life. You start recognizing how many of your choices were driven by fear rather than desire. How many of your relationships were shaped by wounds rather than love. How many of your beliefs were formed by survival rather than authenticity. How often you held yourself back because you were trying to fit into a world that did not understand the complexity of your inner landscape. This recognition is painful, but it is also liberating, because once you see the machinery of your inner world, you can begin to dismantle what no longer serves you. McKenna believed that true transformation requires the courage to face your own contradictions. You are not one thing. You are a constellation of impulses, memories, fears, dreams, and possibilities. You are both shadow and light, both chaos and clarity. And only when you stop fighting one side of yourself can you begin to understand the whole. Integration means allowing your contradictions to coexist without judgment. It means letting your fear sit beside your courage, your doubt beside your intuition, your wounds beside your wisdom. It means understanding that the shadow is not the opposite of light. It is its partner. As you move through this inner territory, something unexpected begins to happen. The fear that once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. The emotions that once drowned you begin to feel navigable. The memories that once haunted you lose their charge. The patterns that once controlled you start to break apart. You begin to feel a sense of spaciousness inside you, as if parts of your mind that were previously locked have started to open. Is the psyche reorganizing itself? This is the shadow becoming conscious. McKenna believed that when the unconscious becomes conscious, the world transforms. Not because the world itself changes, but because the lens through which you perceive it becomes clearer. You begin to see people differently. You begin to understand their shadows. You begin to recognize their... You become less reactive, more grounded, more aware. The noise of the external world loses its power over you because you are learning to hear your own voice beneath it. As this inner clarity strengthens, you begin to feel something deeper, something ancient, something instinctual, something that feels like the core of who you really are. You begin to feel your intuition reawakening, not as a vague feeling, but as a precise internal compass. You begin to feel a sense of alignment, as if your thoughts, emotions, and actions are starting to move in the same direction. You begin to feel a kind of inner authority, a sense that you no longer need permission to exist as yourself. This is not arrogance, it is self-recognition. McKenna believed that once a person reaches this stage, they are no longer controlled by the illusions of society. They are no longer hypnotized by external validation. They are no longer defined by their past. They become self-directed, self-aware, and internally sovereign. But this sovereignty is not a final state. It is a threshold. Because the deeper work, the real work, begins the moment you realize how much of your life was built on illusion and how much potential still lies undiscovered within you. And from this point onward, the journey only pulls you deeper. Because the deeper work is not about improvement, it is about revelation. It is gradual uncovering of layers you did not even know existed, layers that hold both the rawness of your unprocessed emotions and the brilliance of your untapped brilliance. As you move deeper into this unfolding, you begin to sense that the journey is no longer something you are doing. It is something happening through you. It is as if the psyche itself has taken your hand, leading you into chambers you once believed were forbidden. The world around you begins to look different, not because anything external has changed, but because your perception is being rewritten from the inside out. Colors feel more alive. Silence feels more meaningful. Conversations reveal subtext you never noticed. You begin to detect the emotional currents running beneath people's words, the tension behind their smiles, the longing behind their anger. You start to realize how much of human behavior is driven by unconscious forces, how many decisions are shaped by fear rather than freedom, how many dreams are abandoned long before they are spoken aloud. This is the point where your sensitivity increases, not as weakness, but as heightened awareness. You begin to notice the micro-reactions in your own body, the subtle tightening of your chest when something feels out of alignment, the spark of intuition that lights up when something resonates with your deeper truth. You begin to understand that the body itself is a map of your shadow, holding memories in muscles, storing emotions in breath, carrying truths in posture. And the more you listen to these whispers of the body, the clearer your inner world becomes. McKenna believed that the body and mind were not separate realms, but intertwined dimensions of a single experience. When you feel something deeply, the body reacts before the mind interprets. When you suppress something emotionally, the body carries the burden long before the mind acknowledges it. As you continue this inner descent, these connections become impossible to ignore. You start to feel where your truth lives. You start to sense where your lies hide. You start to understand that every tension, every discomfort, every resistance is a gateway waiting to be opened. And with each gateway you pass through, the architecture of your identity shifts. You are no longer the collection of habits you once thought you were. You are no longer defined by the labels people placed on you. You are no longer confined to the expectations you once accepted without question. You begin to realize that identity itself is fluid, not fixed. It is a story, a shape, a structure your mind built to feel safe. And now that structure is expanding, rearranging, dissolving, and rebuilding itself in ways you couldn't have imagined before. But as this expansion happens, an extraordinary thing surfaces, your resistance. Not the loud, dramatic resistance you once recognized, but the quiet, subtle resistance that hides beneath ambition and confidence. The resistance that appears as hesitation, as self-doubt, as the impulse to distract yourself just when you're about to reach something important. The resistance that pulls you back toward familiarity, whispering that the unknown is dangerous and the old patterns are safer. McKenna understood this resistance as the psyche's defense mechanism, a guardian standing at the threshold of change. It is not your enemy. It is the part of you that has survived everything that happened to you. It is the part that protected you when you had no other tools. And as you encounter this resistance, you begin to interact with it differently. Instead of fighting it, you observe it. Instead of suppressing it, you listen. Instead of pushing it away, you let it speak its warnings. And as you do, the resistance softens because it realizes you are no longer a child needing protection. You are becoming the guide your psyche always needed. This shift marks the beginning of a deeper alignment where your inner world begins to reorganize in favor of truth rather than illusion. You start to act not from your wounds, but from your clarity. You begin making choices that resonate with who you are becoming rather than who you were taught to be. You withdraw your energy from people and situations that feed your illusions. You step away from environments where your spirit is dimmed. You start honoring the instincts you used to dismiss, following the impulses that lead you inward, not outward. And as you do, you begin to feel something profound, your inner authority awakening. It is not loud, it is not aggressive, it is calm, steady, grounded. It is the kind of power that does not need validation because it comes from a place beyond the reach of external approval. This is the voice that was buried beneath years of conditioning. This is the voice that knew who you were long before the world told you who to be. And now, as it rises, it starts shaping your life in ways that feel both unfamiliar and inevitable. This rising inner authority brings with it a clarity that cuts through situations with precision. You begin to see what aligns with your truth and what does not, sometimes instantly. You begin to feel when something is an illusion, even when it looks perfect on the surface. You begin to detect the subtle manipulations of culture, the quiet pressures of expectation, the hidden energies behind the decisions you once made unconsciously. And with each insight, the layers of illusion shed a little more. McKenna believed that as a person deepens their inner work, they become a witness to their own evolution. You begin to watch yourself grow in real time. You notice how quickly you catch yourself when you slip into an old pattern. You notice how naturally you gravitate toward honesty, even when it feels vulnerable. You notice how much lighter your mind becomes when you stop carrying the weight of unspoken truths. You notice how your presence changes, how you feel more grounded, more spacious, more attuned to the deeper rhythms of your own being. This attunement brings another shift. Your relationship with discomfort transforms. What once terrified you now intrigues you. What once overwhelmed you now becomes a signal. What once felt like pain now feels like depth. You begin to understand that discomfort is not an enemy, but a guide pointing toward parts of yourself that are ready to evolve. You start moving toward the emotions you used to avoid, recognizing them as the doorways to your most profound insights. You begin to trust that the shadow is not trying to destroy you, it is trying to reveal you. As this trust grows, so does your capacity to see through the illusions of others. You begin to understand their projections, their fears, their hidden wounds. You start seeing how often people act from their unconscious pain rather than their conscious intentions. And instead of taking their behavior personally, you begin to navigate it with awareness. This doesn't mean you tolerate what harms you. It means you no longer internalize what isn't yours. You become a clearer mirror. You see without absorbing. You understand without collapsing. This clarity creates space within you, a kind of internal spaciousness where your thoughts flow without chaos, where your emotions arise without overwhelming you, where your intuition speaks without distortion. You start to realize that the shadow you once feared has become your ally. It shows you your truth before the world does. It warns you when something is misaligned. It reveals what you need to release. It exposes what you are ready to become. And in this unfolding, you begin to sense a deeper momentum pulling you forward. A momentum not driven by ambition, but by expansion. Not by desire, but by authenticity. Not by pressure, but by an inner necessity. A feeling that you can no longer shrink into versions of yourself that were built for survival rather than growth. This momentum is the psyche's way of guiding you toward your next level, drawing you into deeper layers of your mind, pushing you toward a more integrated expression of who you are, and as this force pulls you forward, the journey does not get easier, but it becomes more honest, more real, more inevitable, more you. The path continues to deepen from here, pulling you into territories of the self that only a fully awakened mind can navigate. And as this force pulls you forward, the journey does not get easier, but it becomes more honest, more real, more inevitable, more you. Every step reveals another layer of truth, another piece of the self that had been waiting in silence, another realization that rewrites the architecture of your inner world. The illusion of who you thought you were continues to dissolve like fog burned away by the rising sun. And beneath that fog, a deeper landscape emerges, untamed, unfiltered, alive. As you walk deeper into this landscape, the mind begins to shift from being a prison to becoming a compass. You begin to notice how your thoughts now come with clarity rather than confusion, how your emotions move with intention rather than chaos, how your intuition rises without resistance. The fragmentation that once defined you starts knitting itself back together. The wounded parts you abandoned begin returning home, drawn back by the gravity of your growing authenticity. You can feel the internal reorientation, subtle but relentless, as if your entire being is realigning itself around a truth it had forgotten but never lost. And with every passing day, the inner noise that once dictated your life begins to quiet. Not because it disappears, but because its power dissolves in the presence of awareness. The shadows that once loomed over your decisions shrink as the light of clarity grows. You begin to understand that the darkness was never something outside you trying to devour you. It was simply the absence of understanding. A misunderstood dimension of your own depth. Now that understanding rises like a tide. As the inner world becomes more coherent, your outer world begins to reflect that coherence. You find yourself interacting differently with the world, with people, with your own past, with your emerging future. Conversations feel different because you're no longer speaking from habit, you're speaking from presence. Decisions feel different because you're no longer reacting, you're choosing. Relationships feel different because you're no longer seeking validation, you're offering authenticity. The world doesn't necessarily change, but you navigate it from a place of inner sovereignty rather than unconscious conditioning.
Shift deepens your relationship with reality.
Begin to sense the subtle layers woven beneath everyday experiences. Patterns, energies, unspoken truths, the emotional undercurrents running through situations. What once seemed ordinary now feels textured. What once felt flat now feels multidimensional. McKenna believed that the mind, when freed from illusion, becomes a lens capable of perceiving reality not as a fixed structure, but as a living field of possibilities. And as you move deeper into your inner expansion, you begin to understand exactly what he meant. The boundaries of what you thought was possible stretch. You start noticing flashes of insight that come without warning. You start having moments of profound clarity that feel too precise to be random. You start sensing connections between your thoughts and your environment. You begin to see how your inner state shapes your outer experience. The world becomes a mirror, reflecting the transformation unfolding inside you. The more aligned you become, the more the world aligns with you. But even as this expansion unfolds, the past still whispers. Old memories rise, not as wounds, but as echoes. Echoes of what shaped you. Echoes of what you've survived. Echoes of versions of yourself that carried your burdens when you didn't have the strength to face them. These memories no longer feel like traps. They feel like teachers. Each one reveals a fragment of truth about who you were, who you became, and who you are evolving into. Instead of haunting you, your past begins to integrate into a coherent story. And for the first time, you start feeling gratitude for the darkness you survived, because it forged the awareness you now hold. As this gratitude grows, the internal resistance that once held you back loses its grip. You begin to move through emotional terrain that once paralyzed you. You begin to understand that fear wasn't a sign of danger, it was a sign of depth. The pain wasn't a testament to weakness, it was a testament to sensitivity. That confusion wasn't a flaw, it was the psyche's way of guiding you toward clarity. The parts of yourself you once rejected become the very parts that empower you. The shadow, once your adversary, becomes your compass. Here, in territory of integration, something rare awakens, an unmistakable sense of inner fullness. Not the temporary satisfaction that comes from achievement or external validation, not the fleeting comfort that comes from avoidance. This fullness comes from alignment, from coherence, from embodying your truth without apology. It is the feeling of being whole, even when imperfect. It is the feeling of being grounded, even when uncertain. It is the feeling of being alive in a way you didn't realize was possible. This inner fullness becomes a new kind of strength, not the brittle strength of denial, but the flexible strength of awareness. You begin to understand that real strength has nothing to do with suppressing emotion or pretending you're unaffected. Real strength is the ability to feel deeply without collapsing, to see clearly without running, to stand firmly in your truth, even when the world around you moves like a storm. This is the strength that emerges from the depths of shadow work. The strength that McKenna believed was the birthright of every human willing to face themselves. And as this strength stabilizes, you feel the beginning of something even deeper. A transformation not of mind or emotion, but of identity itself. You are no longer the person shaped by unconscious patterns. You are no longer the character molded by the expectations of others. You are no longer the self that survived by shrinking. You are emerging as the version of yourself that lives from the core, rather than the periphery. The shift is subtle at first, then undeniable. You begin to feel your life reorganizing around who you are becoming, not who you were taught to be. This is where the journey becomes visionary. You start sensing the future not as something distant, but as something unfolding through your present choices. You begin to feel a pull, a quiet but unmistakable force drawing you toward a direction that feels aligned with your deeper purpose. You may not know the details, but you feel the direction. You feel the momentum. You feel the intelligence guiding you. The same intelligence that rose when the illusions began to dissolve. It is here in this widening field of awareness that you understand what McKenna meant when he said the mind is a doorway, not a destination. You begin to perceive your consciousness as a dynamic landscape, capable of evolving, capable of expanding, capable of revealing truths you once believed were beyond your reach. You realize that shadow work was not about becoming perfect. It was about becoming real. It was about reclaiming your inner authority. It was about remembering the parts of yourself that society asked you to forget. And as this realization settles into your bones, the final shift begins. A shift from inner healing to embodied transformation. A shift from exploration to expression. A shift from understanding who you are to living who you are. You feel the alignment between your thoughts, emotions, and actions growing stronger. The gap between your inner truth and outer behavior begins to close. You start expressing your boundaries without guilt. You start pursuing what resonates with your deeper purpose. You start walking away from what diminishes your light. You start creating a life that reflects your inner clarity rather than your past confusion. Your existence becomes intentional. Your presence becomes powerful. And as the shadow becomes integrated, your consciousness becomes whole. The inner wilderness you once feared becomes your home. The truths you once avoided become your guides. The emotions you once suppressed become your allies. The illusions you once clung to become irrelevant. And the version of yourself that steps forward now is not built on hesitation, fear, or survival. It is built on awareness, authenticity, and alignment. This is the point where the journey you've traveled begins to reveal its purpose. Everything you faced, everything you uncovered, everything you confronted leads to this moment. The moment you begin to understand that transformation was never about becoming someone new. It was about remembering who you were before the world told you to forget. It was about reclaiming the truth beneath the illusion, the voice beneath the noise, the light beneath the shadow. And now, as this realization expands through your entire being, the journey continues, not as a struggle, not as an escape, but as a conscious evolution. Because the self you encountered in the depths, the self you integrated from the shadow, the self you reclaimed from the illusion, is the self that will guide you forward. The path does not end here. It begins here. And everything ahead of you unfolds from the truth you have finally chosen to embody.